自己掉着大丘，路上连个人影都没有，还……
怎么了？不害怕啊，不紧张。
他动了，我不知道，他从来没动过呀。
嘿，哥们儿，这是你妈。
真的？好。
A film opens with a strikingly beautiful woman who has just arrived at an airport in the United States. She uses a corset to support her baby bump so that her pregnancy remains unnoticed by airport security. Afterwards, she seems to have trouble communicating with airport staff because she isn't fluent in English, although in the end she successfully makes it through passport control just by using body language. By the way, the name of our main character is Wenjia. She then waits for the arrival of someone who is supposed to serve as her assistant while abroad. After 30 minutes pass, the man finally arrives and apologizes to Wenjia for being late to pick her up. Wenjia immediately scolds the assistant for making her wait for so long. It doesn't stop there. Wenjia is shocked to see a white mouse inside the car that is meant to drive her, even though that mouse is a very clean, well-kept pet. The assistant is forced to tell Wenjia to sit in the front seat. Wenjia is a woman carrying the child of a wealthy, crazy, rich businessman from China. She is the mistress of a super rich entrepreneur in Beijing, who is actually already married. She flew to Seattle to deliver her unborn child at an illegal maternity center due to legal restrictions on childbirth in China. The name of her obedient and quiet assistant is Frank. Frank actually works as a taxi driver, moonlighting as a private driver and personal assistant for people from China. Long story short, the two arrive at a maternity center. However, Frank sees two police officers sealing the building and arresting the facility's operator. It seems the maternity center Wenjia was headed to has been shut down. Wenjia then forces Frank to take her to another maternity center. Frank then takes her to a maternity center owned by a Taiwanese woman he happens to know. The owner of the center happily shows her accommodation to Wenjia. Actually, what is meant by a maternity center isn't a clinic like we usually see in other films, but more like a temporary home for expectant mothers until their babies are born. The maternity center owner, Ms. Huang, then shows Wenjia the room she will be staying in. Wenjia initially dislikes the room because it is too small and doesn't meet the standards for someone like her, a sugar baby. But because there is no other safe place besides Ms. Huang's, Wenjia reluctantly agrees to stay there for the time being. While getting ready to freshen up after a 12-hour flight, she accidentally opens a bathroom door to find another heavily pregnant woman inside. The short-haired woman scolds Wenjia for barging in without knocking first, even though there was a clear sign outside the door. The next day, Wenjia was disturbed by a loud drilling noise that suddenly erupted in the inn. After searching high and low, she found the drilling was coming from the bathroom where the same person she had met earlier was fixing a door hinge. For the second time, they argued because of Wenjia's habit of never knocking before entering a room. The woman with short hair then explained to Wenjia how to read the sign placed on the door. When all the guests gathered, Wenjia asked Ms. Huang to swap her into a larger room. As it turned out, the only large room in the place belonged to Ms. Huang herself. Since Wenjia was the mistress of a wealthy man, she was willing to pay Ms. Huang a fortune to give up her room. Not only that, Wenjia also arrogantly demanded that Ms. Huang do her laundry every single day. She was ready to pay extra for that service. By the way, the short-haired woman's name is Zhou. Zhou mocked Wenjia's arrogance, saying that Ms. Huang's dignity was worth far more than all the wealth Wenjia possessed. Ms. Huang was not the type of person who would do anything for money. Wenjia looked annoyed hearing Zhou's words. Long story short, Wenjia visited a maternity clinic where the doctor spoke Mandarin. Wenjia had trouble filling out the forms because everything was written in English. In the end, Frank helped by translating and filling out the forms for Wenjia. She was amazed at Frank's proficiency in English. On the way back from the clinic, Wenjia accidentally saw a foreigner hugging Zhou. She then asked Frank who was that foreign man. It turned out the man was the father of the baby Joe was carrying. That night, when Gia and Joe got into another fight over a trivial matter, Joe was annoyed because when Gia wouldn't stop spoiling scenes from the TV show she was watching. Meanwhile, when Gia felt jealous seeing that Joe had a tall, handsome foreign boyfriend, the fight between the two was broken up by Ms. Huang. Still annoyed by Joe's behavior, when Gia took Frank to a nightclub to blow off some steam, she couldn't control herself and kept downing alcoholic drinks until she got heavily intoxicated. Although Frank repeatedly tried to stop his boss from drinking for the help of her baby, when Gia, being extremely stressed, had already finished a bottle of beer. When Gia then poured her heart out to Frank, who had been so patient in dealing with a boss like her. Being a pregnant mistress from an illicit affair was not an easy matter. When Gia was willing to cross over to America just to give birth to her baby, especially since her wealthy lover had been getting harder to reach lately. In the morning, when Gia received a call from the father of her unborn child, it turns out the reason her lover called when Gia was because he felt jealous after seeing another man in a photo when Gia posted on her social media account. When Gia explained that the man was just one of her servants. By the way, the name of Wen Jia's sugar daddy is Mr. Zhong. Mr. Zhong asked his girlfriend to spend all the money on the credit card he had obtained from Mr. Zhong as long as Wen Jia doesn't cheat with any other men. Wen Jia complied with her sugar daddy's request. She bought a lot of luxury bags and super expensive fashion items. Wen Jia also didn't forget to buy Frank some luxury clothes as a thank you for accompanying her to the nightclub earlier. Wen Jia said that she was currently very happy because Mr. Zhong would come to see her tomorrow. Wen Jia waited for her lover's arrival from morning until night. It turned out that her lover never showed his face. Instead, Mr. Zhong only sent the package containing an expensive bag as an apology for not being able to visit Wen Jia at this time. Wen Jia, feeling annoyed by Mr. Zhong who never had time for her, decided to take a walk through several blocks in the area where she was staying. Not long after, she saw a car that looked familiar to her. And sure enough, Wen Jia managed to find Frank's house, which turned out to be not far from where she was staying. Frank was stunned and surprised to see his employer arrive at his house. After Frank allowed Wen Jia to enter, Wen Jia boldly walked around, entering every corner of the rooms in Frank's house. She felt amazed and could not believe how someone who worked as a driver like Frank could afford to buy such a large and spacious house. Wen Jia also just realized that Frank lived alone with no one to keep him company. It was at that moment that Frank began to open up about his background to Wen Jia. Frank shared that he actually has a family and has one daughter. It just so happened that his wife was taking their daughter to a party at the time. Frank asked back, "Shouldn't the father of the baby Wen Jia is carrying be coming to see her right now?" Wen Jia immediately said that her lover had broken his promise. Feeling that they were both alone at home, Wen Jia then planned to cook food for her and Frank. Again being pushy, Wen Jia immediately took over Frank's kitchen. She asked Frank to tie an apron around her body. Frank, feeling shy, slowly put on and tied the apron for his employer. After tasting the meal Wen Jia made, Frank did not expect that Wen Jia's cooking would be so delicious for a woman her age. Wen Jia shared that she used to work as an editor for a food magazine, where she often got to taste food at her workplace. Not long after, as the two were chatting away, Frank received a phone call from someone that made him rush off in a hurry. It turned out to be Frank's wife, who informed him that their daughter was having asthma symptoms and had forgotten to bring her medication. Frank hurried to give the breathing inhaler to his daughter. However, it seemed his wife still couldn't leave her important event and had to go back inside. At the same time as Frank carried his daughter to the car, by chance, Frank's wife saw another woman with him. Actually, Frank already knew that his daughter Julie had lied about her asthma symptoms just to go home with him. Julie couldn't stand the strong perfume of her mother's colleagues, and instead of being angry that her father was with another woman, Julie was actually happy to find that her father had finally dared to date someone else. Arriving at the hotel that Wenjia was going to rent, Frank and his daughter saw beautiful fireworks in the sky. Wenjia, carrying a lot of money from her lover, immediately rented a room on the top floor to take Frank and his daughter to watch the fireworks. After the fireworks show ended, the three of them were seen having a good time spending the night together in the luxury hotel room. It turned out that Julie really clicked with Wenjia, who she thought was much more fun than her own mother, who was too busy with work. Arriving at the lodging, Wenjia was shocked to see Joe standing stiffly on the sofa. It turned out that Joe's water had broken and she had to be taken to the hospital immediately. Because Wenjia wasn't fluent in English and didn't want to make Joe wait for an ambulance, she tried to find a ride herself in the complex area where she was staying. Wenjia had to run for 3 blocks just to find help in the sparsely populated town, until finally Wenjia managed to stop a passing car driver. At the hospital, Frank came to meet his employer, who was annoyed by how quiet the city of Seattle was. Few minutes later, she suddenly fell silent while holding her bulging belly, which made Frank panic too. It turned out Wenjia felt a quite strong kick from her baby, which had never happened before. Frank was also happy when he could feel the movement of the fetus inside his employer's womb. After going through several hours of labor with all the hard work, Joe successfully gave birth to her first child naturally without a cesarean section. And now a surprising fact about her relationship with the white man began to be revealed. Actually, the white man was the one who had donated his sperm to Joe. Meanwhile, Joe herself had a same-sex partner, a relationship they had shared since they were both in college. When Joe arrived at the lodging, she gave a gift to Wenjia as a form of gratitude for having gone to the trouble of running around the complex to help her. In short, Wenjia's pregnancy had now reached 6 months. The doctor who performed the ultrasound on Wenjia said that the fetus's condition was normal and healthy, and the doctor even couldn't believe it when seeing the growth of the baby's brain organs clearly visible on the monitor. One day, Julie visited Wenjia's place. Julie was left temporarily with Ms. Huang because her father went to New York for medical training. Actually, Frank once mentioned that he was a surgeon back in China. However, Frank's medical career did not last long after his wife decided to immigrate to America. At first, he and his wife worked at the same hospital. Eventually, his wife's career grew much more successful after she was appointed a manager at a pharmaceutical company. Like it or not, Frank had to follow his wife's wishes. Long story short, one day, Wenjia decided to take Julie to visit her father in New York. Hearing the invitation, Julie immediately agreed to Wenjia's crazy idea. Upon arriving in New York City, for some reason, Julie suddenly provoked the police to arrest Wenjia. As a result, Julie's prank caused both of them to be detained at the police station. And as usual, Wenjia, who is not fluent in English, repeatedly used hand gestures. Luckily, not long after, Frank arrived to pick up Julie and Wenjia. Because of Julie's actions, the situation became more complicated after the police checked Wenjia's documents and residence permit, and Wenjia was threatened with deportation and could not give birth to her baby in America. After Frank succeeded in freeing them, he got angry and snapped at Wenjia for recklessly bringing his daughter to New York without telling him. According to Frank, Wenjia has no right to disturb and interfere in his family's life. Wenjia, who from the start only wanted to have fun with Julie, then apologized to Frank. Arriving in Seattle, Wenjia suddenly experienced issues using the credit card given by her lover when trying to book a luxury hotel. Somehow, her credit card was already blocked when she tried to use it. Not only that, Wenjia also could not reach any of Mr. Zhang's phone numbers, leaving her completely confused. Wenjia asked Frank to lend her his credit card so she could book a room. However, Frank instead took Wenjia to a cheaper motel. When they arrived at the motel Frank chose, Wenjia kept trying to contact her lover who seemed to have vanished into thin air. She even tried calling every acquaintance of Mr. Zhang, though in the end no one knew where Mr. Zhang was. That was when Wenjia began to have bad feelings about her lover. Wenjia immediately cried in front of Frank because she realized her money was gone. Frank immediately calmed Wenjia down by taking her into her room. When Wenjia returned to her lodging, it turned out that one of her housemates named Moon was ready to give birth. Few moments later, she received a call from a woman who turned out to be Mr. Zhang's legal wife. The woman informed Wenjia that Mr. Zhang had now been arrested for fraud. It turned out Zhang was a corrupt businessman. The police had blocked all bank accounts and frozen all of his secret lover's assets. Realizing that she now had no money and no longer received funding from anywhere, Wenjia's life had now turned 180 degrees from before. She decided to help with all the housework like washing clothes and cleaning toilets to earn wages from Ms. Huang. However, Ms. Huang kept asking Wenjia not to push herself too hard for the sake of the baby's health. She even frequently took the time to open a stall to sell all her luxury branded bags and shoes. Frank felt concerned seeing his former employer's financial condition becoming increasingly critical, especially while Wenjia was heavily pregnant. Now, Wenjia no longer used Frank's services because she couldn't afford to pay him. One day, when Moon was returning to China, she kindly gave a large supply of baby necessities to Wenjia for free. Seeing Moon's sincerity made Wenjia cry tears of emotion. As they hugged, Moon said that a woman as kind as Wenjia deserved a good man who would always be by her side through thick and thin. Money is not the most important thing. Moon told Wenjia to find a life partner who is sincere and capable of taking care of her. Wenjia then returned Moon's kindness by giving her one of her branded bags. After Moon's departure, Ms. Huang had a private conversation with Wenjia. She informed her that she would likely not be home when Wenjia gave birth because her daughter was having a wedding. Not only that, Ms. Huang, who already knew about the crisis Wenjia was experiencing, planned to return all the rent money Wenjia had paid her. Wenjia immediately refused Ms. Huang's good intentions, which she felt were excessive. But to her surprise, Ms. Huang had already sent all the money to Wenjia's personal account without her knowledge. Hearing that, Wenjia immediately hugged Ms. Huang, who was already like her own mother. One night, Frank suddenly came to the inn and went straight into Wenjia's bedroom. When Wenjia peeked, she found Frank crying while looking at a photo of his wife. Wenjia, feeling curious, immediately visited Frank's house and asked what was happening to him. Frank now spoke honestly that he had actually divorced his ex-wife years ago. Then yesterday he heard news that his ex-wife would be marrying another man who was much more successful than him. One thing that saddened him was the matter of Julie's custody, which had long been held by his ex-wife. Frank surrendered custody of Julie to her mother because he felt Julie deserved a decent life. Like in the near future, he would be separated from his beloved daughter. Then Wenjia accompanied Frank to pick up the dress he had ordered for his ex-wife. But just a few steps into the bridal boutique, a shop assistant immediately assumed that Wenjia was Frank's wife. But Wenjia herself was actually enthusiastic about the shop assistant's misunderstanding and lied as if she were indeed Frank's wife. The boutique assistant promptly offered the best maternity dress they had in stock. She then told Frank and Wenjia that it was their boutique's tradition to photograph couples who buy their most expensive dress. Frank, looking clueless, initially objected because he knew Wenjia wasn't actually his wife. However, after being pressured by the boutique assistant and Wenjia herself,
可能我这辈子都不会再穿婚纱了。
Frank finally agreed to pose next to Wenjia, albeit feeling quite bashful. That night, after Frank cooked dinner for Wenjia, she spotted the shabby suit he planned to wear to his ex-wife's wedding. She immediately took it to iron, even though Frank tried to stop her from doing any heavy activity. Before attending his ex-wife's wedding, Frank made time to take Wenjia for a checkup and left her at the clinic. Soon after, Frank was surprised by Wenjia's sudden arrival at the event wearing her new dress. It turned out Wenjia had bought the dress she tried on earlier with her own money. By the way, the name of Frank's ex-wife is Linda. Naturally, Wenjia wouldn't just stand by seeing her personal driver dumped by a greedy woman like Linda. When they met to introduce themselves, Wenjia immediately claimed to be Frank's girlfriend in front of Linda and her husband. She also embarrassed them both by boasting that Frank was a very impressive man in bed. Linda, feeling uncomfortable, immediately walked away from the two of them. Instead of being angry, Frank tested Wenjia, who was now becoming fluent in English. As Wenjia and Frank danced together, she critiqued his movements, saying he seemed too stiff, nervous, and uneasy. In reality, Frank was just finding it difficult to dance with a pregnant woman with such a large belly like Wenjia. Their intimate moment successfully made Linda jealous. However, that happiness did not last long. Wenjia suddenly lost consciousness while in Frank's arms. Frank immediately rushed her to the nearest hospital. According to the medical report from Dr. Tang, Wenjia was suffering from pregnancy poisoning known as preeclampsia. It happened because Wenjia showed signs of hypertension due to her unhealthy lifestyle and frequent late nights. After regaining consciousness, Wenjia immediately asked Frank about her baby's condition. Fortunately, the baby was successfully saved. Now she knew that Frank had saved both her life and her baby's. Frank patiently gave all his attention to Wenjia, who still required full bed rest due to her hypertension. For 3 full days, Frank stayed by Wenjia's side, even though he was no longer receiving pay from her. One day, Julie finally returned to Frank's arms because Linda had handed over custody to him. Day after day, they lived like a happy family. This included Julie, who grew very fond of Wenjia's son. But yet again, that happiness came to a sudden halt when Mr. Zhong's men arrived to take Wenjia back to his side. It turned out Mr. Zhong had been cleared of his legal charges and had divorced his legal wife. That was when Wenjia planned to return all the money Frank had spent on her childbirth surgery, as well as to repay all the sacrifices Frank had made for her. But Frank still refused the money and instead tucked it into Wenjia's baby carrier. Meanwhile, Julie could only hide inside the house, unable to bear the sadness of being left by the woman she loved most. Finally, with heavy hearts, they parted ways forever. However, becoming a permanent resident in Mr. Zhong's mansion did not seem to make Wenjia happy. How could it when her lover remained set in his ways, always too busy chasing the world rather than spending time with his partner? Wenjia could only spend her time alone in the super luxurious house without feeling any happiness within it. This made Wenjia constantly daydream, recalling beautiful memories with Frank and Julie. Eventually, she decided to end her relationship with Mr. Zhong and chose to live independently in a small apartment with her son, Mao. Wenjia earned a living by creating a website that featured various things about toddler food. She earned income from every advertisement placed on her website. Zhou and Moon also frequently communicated face-to-face with Wenjia. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Frank tried his luck applying to a renowned hospital in New York City. Both were very happy after learning that Frank had succeeded in getting a permanent job as a doctor. After 2 years of being apart from Wenjia, Frank and his daughter playfully took a photo on top of the Empire State Building and sent it to Wenjia. It turned out that Wenjia and Frank just realized they were in the same place at that time. After struggling to find each other, they finally met at the top of the Empire State Building. While Julie took Mao around to play, Wenjia and Frank chatted casually, asking about how they had each been doing over the last 2 years. Now, for the first time, Frank gathered the courage to touch Wenjia's fingers. The two held hands, signaling Frank's seriousness about starting a new life with his former employer.